Hi, I'm here with Karen and Michael, and we're here to have a conversation today about the mental health needs of and challenges of people with autism and ADHD. So Karen and Michael, would you like to introduce yourselves? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Thanks for having us here today. My name's Karen. I'm the Strategy Manager at the West Cheshire Autism Hub. I absolutely love that role, and central to that role is breaking down many of the barriers that autistic people and their families experience. As well as my job role, I have lived experience with all of my family members being autistic and having coexisting and existing conditions such as ADHD and other mental health conditions. And I also have a trans female daughter as well.
Okay.
Hopefully my lived experience will be relevant today as well as my professional.
That's great. Great to have you with us, Michael.
Hi, my name is Michael Liebe. I am the co-founder and director of ND Directed CIC. We are a neurodivergent support CIC in the local area, currently operating in Ellesmere Port and Cheshire West. We're providing a free education and support program called the Insight Program to local families, which has been really helpful for some. A bit about myself. So I was diagnosed autistic at 11. I was diagnosed ADHD about 26. Lot of looking back, expelled from school very early, involved in all sorts of silliness growing up, it's been a real sort of awakening, shall I say, when you sort of see the increase in knowledge and awareness that we have about certain things and how we can look at certain behaviours slightly differently. It's a good time, I think. Still a lot of work to do.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for your introductions. I thought we'd begin just by exploring, just at a kind of ground level, really, what the kind of mental health challenges might be for people living with autism, diagnosed or not, and then ADHD. Do you want to start off with that, Karen? How might that be experienced?
I think you see a couple of different issues here. We see people at the West Cheshire Hub as part of Dial West Cheshire, where we're based. We see a number of individuals that have been misdiagnosed. So we see a lot of people that have been diagnosed with EUPD
right,
and such forth.
So that's emotionally unstable personality disorder.
Yeah.
If people
and they
familiar with that,
obviously, we're not clinicians, but they don't feel that diagnosis represents themselves. And we're seeing that a lot, which I think is part of a bigger picture. I think that is something that is talked about nationally. I would say we're seeing a huge increase in trauma, and we're having to sort of find out more about using a trauma-informed approach,
Sure.
Extensively researching it. The staff are, rapidly upskilling ourselves. We're seeing a lot of quite complex presentations with numerous coexisting conditions, alongside being autistic. And we are obviously an autism service, but some of those conditions do feel, out of our remit. So maybe, psychosis, schizophrenia, those kinds of conditions.
Okay.
And you do your very, very best for that person. And you want to support them in terms of their autism and the stress that they experience from just feeling like they live in a world which is not designed for them. And I have to say, I don't think the world is designed for them. It's chaotic, it's confusing, it's fast-paced.
Okay.
I think a lot of neurotypical people, if there is such a thing, are quite overwhelmed with life and the pace it is. So I think neurodivergent people, they're just not being set up to succeed from the off, really. And they're coming to us with lots of coexisting problems. And they've experienced throughout their life, a huge percentage of them, bullying or victimisation. And for a variety of different reasons, then I've had a trauma response. So
Okay.
A lot of them have PTSD.
Thank you for that. That's given us a great insight into both your work and also the kind of challenges that people are facing. Michael, what about ADHD and mental health, and how do those work together?
Sure. I think it can be a really difficult question that for clinicians and also for individuals themselves at the moment. We like to talk in very sort of absolute terms. It's a lot easier for us to understand things if people talk to us in definites. The challenge is that when it comes to mental health and also ADHD, a lot of the way that we assess those behaviours are subjective, so they're through experience, etc. So the challenge with ADHD is almost, I feel, like a bit of a chicken and egg situation. People are sometimes they're diagnosed ADHD, however, they also have significant mental health challenges. And it has, is the ADHD playing an active role in developing those mental health challenges? It's very common. Some of the traits of ADHD, we have a very fast mind, we're very self-critical, we tend to have very low self-esteem. Now, obviously, I could say those traits and those characteristics under a mental health umbrella, and it would also hit some criteria. So this is, I think it gets very confusing in terms of what are people trying to address themselves.
And a classic there that's come to my mind is emotional dysregulation, as it's called, or people struggling to regulate their emotions. And I'm guessing that may well be something that could raise some questions about whether somebody is living with autism or ADHD because of that, or potentially a mental health issue. So we can perhaps understand that, am I right, some of the challenges that clinicians might face, and also community-based organisations might face, and individuals actually.
Which is which.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, in some cases, I suppose the issue is, do you need to identify which is which? So
yes.
In some cases you do. But I think we're very keen, in Western world, of putting people in boxes.
Yes.
Actually, it's intersectional. And where does the autism blur with the ADHD, and the ADHD and the autism blur with mental health?
With mental health.
Like you say, which comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah.
And we're just talking about sensory sensitivities.
Sure.
Highly anxious, traumatised people are more sensitive to sensory stimuli. And if you're being bombarded with sensory stimuli, you're going to be really anxious, aren't you? So,
yes.
So does it matter which comes first? It's the treatment of the person as a whole, isn't it?
I think that's really helpful.
We've got to.
Sure. So people, present wherever they go, but perhaps particularly in community-based organisations, which tend to have a more kind of holistic view, present as their whole selves. They present as who they are. What's your understanding of the experience that those people might have if they try to get some help specifically with mental health through the GP or through whatever other route that they choose?
Sure. I think, again, it comes back to the same challenge. At the moment, because of the service provision availability in the local area, be it ADHD, autism, mental health, we are in a situation where practitioners, professionals, clinicians want to do something. They want to help that person. Where do they put them? So sometimes, even though it's not the best fit, they're getting put somewhere. So we have had conversations with Step 4 clinical leads, etc., who have a feel that, there may be mental health suspicions which are actually fall more easily under the category of ADHD. However, the challenge is, as we've recently heard, the government have come out with, estimated 8-year waiting list. Now, that's if we are all one homogenous bubble, but if you go to area specific, that number creeps up to about 12 to 13 years in some areas. And as a clinician, and I have so much respect for the NHS and everyone who works within it, what do you do with that individual? How do I help them?
And I guess this is where we would all benefit from looking at the mental health system, including the community sector, as one system, so that we can help people to find the right place to be for them. Because actually maybe in clinical services, let alone clinical psychology, which is Step 4, may not at all be the right place or what they need right now. Do you have any thoughts on the challenges and the barriers?
I was just thinking, one way forward, which may be that there be sort of overlapping issues that would arise between ADHD and autism, and maybe just cost effectiveness, a joined up approach rather, we're really keen on dialing, I'm sure you are as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Taking a joined up approach because everybody wants to do their very best. I think the main pressure on services is resources. Everyone's really stretched. And I think you sort of alluded to it, Michael, is people are finding the closest fit and then signposting to there. And that it's not always the best for the person because they've been sent from pillar to post. And actually quite often the service that ends up seeing them is the one with the largest wide open door policy that is literally they're going to end up there, and that might not be the best fit.
Yes.
So it just might be dependent on a postcode lottery, who's got most availability at that time. And I think what we need is a joined up approach across services, how we do that cost effectively so that we're not duplicating. I sometimes feel that we're seeing the same people quite often, and then it comes to they're actually having the same conversation with us, perhaps about some of their worries with multiple services. That's not a good use of services.
I was going to ask about that because there's that whole the phrase that I hear a bit is people bouncing around the system, and that will probably be because people with autism and ADHD or both don't necessarily feel they fit anywhere, and the clinicians maybe not knowing how to respond. Do you see that bouncing around going on?
I do, absolutely. And I think, as Karen's quite rightly said, it comes down to the sort of complexity of what we're trying to assess and what we're trying to understand here. Sure. There are very individual aspects about ADHD and autism, but there is also a lot of overlapping aspects as well in certain presentations. It's exactly the same with mental health. So there is often, and it's openly acknowledged. Some clinicians, because it is so difficult, and as Karen's quite rightly said, we have this belief that we can put something as subjective and complex as human behaviour within very neat boxes. Now we like that because that allows clinicians and researchers to do much needed work, and it's how science is done. That's great. However, when it comes to treatment understanding, because we are now in a position where we are dealing with super complex, subjective experiences such as mental health, ADHD and autism, those boxes aren't that effective anymore. Which again, I'm on a bit of a long one here, but I think as well, exactly as Karen said, what the third sector can offer is that flexibility. Rightly so, NHS has held to very high standards in terms of, who's dealing with who departments, and that has to be that. With a more communal, holistic approach, we can take a much more person-centred and sort of wrap-around approach, and we can be more flexible within our support.
I agree with that. I know we're really, really flexible. Sometimes I find myself, we're sitting on the floor with cushions and blankets and do whatever, and I go home at the end of the day and think, gosh, we've really had some interesting, it's been great to deliver an appointment, holding cuddly toys with cushions and blankets on the floor. If that's put that person at ease, then then we will do that. I do wonder whether there is enough flexibility just because of the pressures within clinical services, and we are able to do that. Obviously there are other things in the third sector. We're often low on resources, but there are a lot of challenges for the neurodivergent community in terms of developing mental health conditions, and I think reaching the threshold for services, and it's back to that flexibility again. But if they're assessing this, whether they reach the threshold for services, and it is just a series of questions with tick boxes, then it can miss things like, is somebody actually answering that question truthfully? Are they masking? Are they, actually struggling a lot more than they appear? Those kind of things that aren't really picked up by, and actually back to bouncing around from services to services. Normally when that happens, it's because a person's needs aren't being met.
Sure.
It only happens for that reason. There's a phrase that I once read in a journal article and thought, I don't like that phrase. Was it revolving door customer? And if there is such a thing, nobody does that.
Nobody wants to do
reason.
that.
Yeah.
There's a reason, and it's normally desperation. I think what I'm sort of wary of is, say, if somebody's particularly ruminating and anxious, then I'm quite cautious about the talking and sort of growing in terms of, I call it the egg white effect, that if you whisk egg whites, they're going to grow and get bigger.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes...
It's an interesting analogy. I've not heard that one before.
It's, you know, I think it was Dan Beagle, who's an autistic man, who you know, came up with that idea. And that anxiety will just grow and grow. What we want to do is give people tools, not keep feeding it, because otherwise it's just going to grow. So we want those tools. And it's just joining up those services.
And I think
everybody.
It's really important to remember, isn't it, that when people are moving around between services, whatever we call that, and things aren't getting any better, the chances are they're getting worse.
Yes.
And generally speaking, people's mental health is probably going to become a bigger thing than it needed to have done if actually we just got some preventive type work in there. I mean, hence your Insight program, Michael, that you mentioned is about helping people to understand themselves and their own responses, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'm sure you're doing similar work.
Yeah, if I can just touch on that. And I think, Karen already mentioned, executive function earlier on when we were chatting. And I think, we can, also as well, Karen mentioned threshold, and that's a very important thing to consider. And it's a difficult conversation. We do have a lot of, there is noise on both sides of debates at the moment. There are very critical, dismissive, certain tabloids, I'm sure I don't need to name who do come out with some quite interesting facts, inverted commas. But also as well, we do have this very strong drive towards diagnosis and medication. Now, as my private work as a professional, but also in our groups, I see plenty of people who have had a diagnosis and they have had medication, and it is not the full answer. And I think, exactly as Karen said before, the world we live in is such an antagonistic world, sensory-wise, information-wise, overload. We wake up in the morning, we will automatically get a flood of various global situations. We know all the negative stuff that's happening in the world. We will see people arguing. We put ourselves in a psychological battery farm, and then we're awake all day. Now, if you also couple that with we don't respect sleep, we don't often understand what's in our food, and things like that. So there can be various factors that are influencing us. So I think it is important that people take that time to see they might not have to wait. They might be able to implement some strategies that can really help them just think, I'm okay. They might not have to, because this is another thing. It's one thing telling people to go on a diagnosis waiting list, but unless you are going to actively support that person whilst they are on that waiting list, and I personally class it as quite irresponsible, because being on a waiting list is added stress. And unless we can mitigate that stress ourselves, we shouldn't be directing people directly to diabetes.
Just want to touch as well on. Thank you. I just want to touch as well on the idea that obviously there are assessment processes, but there's also treatment, and just kind of leaving medication for ADHD to one side, because that's a specialist thing that only applies really to ADHD. There's also the likes of counselling. If somebody has had trauma, there's trauma focused. There's CBT, there's trauma-focused CBT, there are other therapies, and of course there's the likes of clinical psychology or psychotherapy. So, and the stuff that they offer. How do you feel that people with autism and ADHD could engage with realistically those models of therapy, those current offerings of counselling or CBT or whatever, and the process that you go through? How does that generally, if you're able to comment?
I think it's well known that the current sort of system is not a good fit for neurodivergent individuals. I kind of felt myself frustrated in recent years because it's almost being part of the conversation. As talked about, as if it's such a massive problem, it needs a huge sort of piece of work to fix it. I actually don't think it does. I actually think many of the things that could actually make a huge difference are quite simple. So, things like extra processing time. We have very little resources at the West Cheshire hub, and yet we still make some adjustments that make a world of difference. So we take the pressure out of eye contact by sitting sideways. We make sure there's a summary of appointments. and people know what to expect. And we've got, just some fiddle toys and sensory toys nearby. We're quite happy to sit on the floor and, do whatever is needed. We would sit with the lights dimmed and practically in the dark if it helped. It doesn't matter. And I think, we've said the word flexible so many times. Flexibility, it's not expensive. It's a change of mindset. It's a think outside the box.
Sure.
And I think if we do that and we have that willingness to do that, then actually many people that currently can't access certain models of therapy could access it.
Yeah.
I appreciate it's still going to be difficult, but giving somebody a visual summary or a written down task list of what they've talked about, just as a prompt, because so many of our members, if we didn't do that, they would come out of the appointment and actually not remember what we talked about. I have to say it's incredibly beneficial for myself as well, to look back and to make sure that we're actually managing that person's case.
Interestingly, I mean, if you think about that, Karen, it's not actually unusual, is it? Because I was reading about the stats on the number of people who go to eye condition appointments who come out afterwards completely kind of bamboozled and not really understanding what they've just been through. And then there are these fortunately, in some trusts, there are eye clinic liaison officers who will go in and support people and then come out afterwards and support them.
Yeah.
Precisely because that interaction can be challenging for anyone. And we're not talking there about people who are living who are neurodivergent. So, and it's the same for most of us. If we go to a difficult health appointment, we're probably going to want someone with us. So this isn't rocket science, really, in a sense, is it?
I think that's the crux of it. It isn't rocket science, and actually anything that is really beneficial for autistic people or people that have ADHD, neurodivergent people in general, it's not going to do any harm to the rest of the population. So I think personalisation and person-centred care is something that's banded around. It's said all the time.
Yeah.
We've actually, is it actually really happening? Because if we're doing person-centred care, then actually any person is going to get that, regardless of whether they're neurodivergent or not. So, to me, it shouldn't be as big an issue as it is. I understand I'm kind of, with my rose-tinted glasses on and I'm looking at it, but I think it's a massive issue. But then so is the fact that we're not meeting the mental health needs of this cohort of individuals. So actually, if we were doing that, maybe it would relieve the pressure elsewhere. That's just my...
Yes.
personal view on it. But
sure.
I appreciate it's difficult, but I think some of it is a change of mindset.
Absolutely, I'd agree with you, Karen, there. So I do quite a bit of work within some really large organisations, actually, about sort of work practice and etc. Not so much on a specific individual level, but just general work ethos. And something I say is, what's more important? What's important here? Objective or process? And obviously everyone always says, well, objective, obviously. I said, okay, well, your employee's going to come in 4 hours a day. Okay, they're going to work 4-day week, but they're going to be more productive. How do you feel about that? They're not doing that. Why? Because it's not work, is it? And then all of a sudden, it drops. And I think we can see that kind of ingrained culturalism within all sorts of spheres, can't we? Including appointments, medical practice. I'm perhaps going off track a little bit here, but as a society, we're all very stressed. There are economic challenges, there are individual mental health challenges. We are dealing with technology that our brain just hasn't had the time to catch up with that.
Sure. So
not only are we dealing with individuals who are heightened, but then also other professionals also under pressure. So everyone is just So that flexibility, that space and that headspace to be more flexible. I think we owe it to our NHS professionals, medical professionals, to give them that space, which is obviously something they don't get at the moment. But also as well, exactly as you said, Karen, it is a very little adjustment, often. So with ADHD, classic is forgetting of appointments. Okay, working memory, executive function, working memory is often very poor. Different, shall I say. It does, mine causes me enough issues. So that kind of thing, but then at the same time, the NHS policy is, and I was speaking to someone who had an NHS ADHD assessment not long ago, and they were giving me some feedback for one of the projects we're doing about the third sector involvement. And if you miss an appointment, you're off the list.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, this is ADHD specialists creating rules that are very clearly going to be broken at some point, unless there is rigorous. You know, if you're not reminding that person 24, even the day before, if they've not got the capacity or have not learned the skills, because it is skills. We don't learn organisation in school.
No.
You know, hey, no one's sat me. We should. We should have lessons on how to do planners and how to organise your time. Because it's just assumed, and it is assumed, because that is a very common executive function trait that we are often pretty good at as human beings. Now, when it comes to sometimes some autistic traits can really struggle with organisation. ADHD, you know, it's that classic, almost stereotypical behaviour, isn't it?
Yes.
So I think, you know, there could be a heck of a lot more considerations made, and it would likely make things
simple,
a bit
quite simple.
super
Actually, saying
simple.
there, actually, we have a few members at the moment that have missed a few appointments, and we have schedules in the diary to remind them, and we're going to try, you know, doing that more. Obviously, if you reminded them on the day, there's someone said that, you know, it's going to get some point that you're going to have to book.
That's a really good point, though.
There's not one striking you out by any means.
No.
I guess we need to recognise, don't we, that both of you are operating in quite small organisations. If these scale up, and we're looking at hundreds or thousands of people coming through, the tendency is for that to have to be more sort of systematically designed. Nevertheless, I suppose our challenge to that is think about how we're designing it. Okay, it's got to be designed as a process, because you can't just have a kind of a much more organic process that you'd have in a small organisation. That's fair enough, but it's about how we design that process, isn't it, to bear in mind the needs of neurodivergent people, but also some of the other groups that we're talking about in this project, like people whose language may not be their first language may not be English, or people who are living with a visual impairment or a hearing impairment. Those are all really good challenges, I think. Do we want to talk at all about the experience of people who feel they may have traits of both autism and ADHD, and how that affects people?
It's very common, I'm sure.
Sure, I mean, I'm dual diagnosis is what they. I was actually diagnosed with Asperger's. It's not a term we use anymore for various reasons. But yeah, definitely with that dual diagnosis. But again, I look back, and again, even now, you know, this is the thing, because we're dealing with such subjective experiences. And also as well, I'm always very mindful. I always remind people, remember, the way we feel is part of a million influences. Do you know what I mean? It can be the things we've eaten, the way we've slept, the things we breathe. They will, you know, things we've experienced growing up, things we haven't had or have had. So again, it's really complicated, and a lot of individuals who do get a dual diagnosis or suspect they have both ADHD and autism, it is very confusing, and again, it's this self-doubt that's created. It's this constant rechecking, reassessing oneself. Have I really got that? Have I really got that? Do I really have both? Yeah, sure. And you know, and something that. This is something that we have to, and this area I think people can not get frustrated, but people are very driven towards absolutes within the ADHD space especially, and also the autism space, but the science isn't absolute, and that's okay. We're still learning lots.
In that sense, I mean, I'm interested in, Karen, in your experience of that kind of duality. Do people experience a bit of both? And are we, as a challenge to ourselves really, are we over dependent on labels and boxes and saying, I want to get to the point where I can say that's my ADHD talking, or that's my autism, and then I kind of feel comfortable. Whereas do we need to be a bit more fluid than that?
Yeah, I think we do need to be fluid. I mean, I haven't got an aversion to labels. Like, you know, I think people need a diagnosis. That's my personal opinion, although I respect self-identification, obviously. But many people do need that. I think then what you do see is when they have dual diagnosis, they try and do, well, which traits are autism and which traits are ADHD? And in that regard, I would agree. I don't think, they need to necessarily know where they fit, succinctly. We see a lot with our members. Obviously, we're an autism-specific service, but we will see in their assessment or support appointments them talking about the conflict that they're experiencing between what they see as their ADHD and what they see as autism. So they will often talk about how they're driven to do certain things from an ADHD perspective, which they feel conflicts with what they need to do from an autism perspective. So say they've had a history of autistic burnout, they feel they really need to manage their emotional and social capacity, in terms of spoons, for those of you who know about spoon theory. So they want to measure and sort of really budget their outlay, their personal outlay on a day, but then actually their ADHD may lead them to be more hyperactive or impulsive, and they can get quite more prone to burnout. So there's that aspect. I've had people say about medication, how they feel it's dialed up. Myself and Michael were talking before about the impact on sensory aspects. Medication for ADHD can, in some people, dial up their sensory experience, which can heighten their anxiety. But like we were saying earlier, it's really difficult to separate out exactly what, and actually it's just the person as a whole. And I'm not really, if we're going to talk about labels, I think the label I have a real sort of aversion to would be high functioning or low functioning. We don't do functioning labels. I don't like, level 1, level 2. I don't like any of that.
Sure.
Because it's really misleading. People have a spiky profile, it's ADHD or autism. You can't just easily say somebody's severely affected or mildly affected. And we have a huge amount of people that on the surface may be labelled with, they're just high functioning or they're mildly affected, primarily because they're verbal or they may have a job, or they're married, or all of these perceptions that people have. My husband, for example, it's been said to him, you can't be autistic because you're married and you have a job. And actually that really invalidates that experience of sensory overload or burnout. It really invalidates that. And actually, so many things are hidden beneath the surface, and there are many things. We were talking about executive functioning before, Michael. There are many things that humans can do instinctively and intuitively, with very little effort. But then, for the neurodivergent community, there are those that never manage to pull some of these skills off. There are others that do, but with a huge amount of cost to them cognitively, and they are burnt out and they're exhausted. And I think, both myself and Michael can relate to that. And that it increases the burden on the individual. And if you put enough pieces of cargo on a ship, ultimately it sinks. This is what you were saying before about life being too crazy.
Sure, absolutely. And I think, the whole person-centered, there is need for diagnosis. There are some people out there who, with ADHD will need medication. They may struggle so much with emotional regulation that they can either cause harm to themselves or harm to others, and there are those individuals.
Or focus and,
focus and attention, etc. And I think also, as Karen said, this very neat diagnosis, categorization of behaviours, and we talk about them like they only exist within that diagnosis. Well, OCD has been quite apparent within ADHD. So people hit a stressful sort of life event, etc. And then all of a sudden they're hygiene obsessed. They're doing rituals,
which is about control and
So if we were going to use those boxes, there's another diagnosis of OCD. Now, is that helpful?
Is that helpful?
Is that helpful?
Do we just need to look at behaviours really?
Why they're happening?
Why is that happening?
Why is it happening?
And understanding yourself.
And I think, as Karen mentioned before, many people who cups might not have overflowed or functioned very well, masking, etc. Well, again, COVID hit people in so many different ways. You know, the isolation didn't do well for people. With a lot of ADHD individuals, substance misuse massively increased, you know, for some persons, you know, because that's a very common factor within people with ADHD.
Yes, with ADHD and addiction.
So I think there's a combination, and yes, it has come to the service, and masks have slipped, and that could be an explanation why we are seeing increases in diagnoses. Again, you know, it's not really right in terms of how that's framed sometimes. You know, people's cups are full.
Okay, well, we've had a really in-depth and detailed discussion there. That's been really good. I just wondered if we could wrap up with just kind of batting around some more sort of quick-fire suggestions about our vision for a better world of provision and support, whether it's in the community, with peer groups, with treatment, whatever it might, with assessment. So some little quick wins that we think, or even bigger things, but just some. Let's just knock a few around. What do you think?
Willingness to be flexible. Look from the autistic and the ADHD perspective.
Okay.
Neurodivergent perspective.
I'm going to put that under the heading of empathy, in the sense of trying to get into the headspace of neurodivergent experience, I guess.
I think absolutely. I think flexibility is one. I think also as well we should be much more focused on educating and helping people with looking at things like executive function skills. You know, if there are any support individuals can get at the moment. Education is key. I don't feel this, especially through the NHS pathways, there tends to be very little to no education.
Sort of psychoeducation.
Psychoeducation can be really effective. But also as well, you know, if we stop, I think we medicalise things very quickly, you know, and I think we need to understand why we do that sometimes. But I think we also need to understand that not all behaviours may need it. You know, if you look at the ADHD criteria.
So we've had that empathy-driven flexibility, and we've had a call for greater insight and psychoeducation to help people understand themselves and live in the world. Are there any others?
Practical strategies, I think, as you were saying there,
Practical.
in terms of executive functioning, there are some things that could be really helpful to people.
Yes.
I think that's really, really important. I think we need to move away from this less deficit sort of focused sort of model. I think so many things, even when we think we're being positive, it's everywhere in the community how we view neurodivergence. And we need to sort of almost just take a step back and re-examine everything and think, how do we, and if as a person you feel that you are somehow lesser because you are different, that is really stigmatizing. And I think, Michael was talking to me before about, feeling on the periphery of things, marginalised. And a lot of minority groups, not just neurodivergent groups, feel that very strongly.
Sure.
And we really need to work really hard when we work, especially in the third sector, to sort of get out there and really promote those spaces where people feel like they really belong, that sense of community. And
so we've had that sense of empathy, empathy-driven services, so they're flexible. We've had the idea of, sorry, what was your one, Michael? I've forgotten. I'm trying to sum up it.
It was sort of more psychoeducation, wasn't it?
Psychoeducation. So we've had empathy-driven flexibility. We've had psychoeducation.
Sure.
And then we're talking there about sense of belonging and a kind of an asset-based approach, I think you were talking about, really, weren't you, rather than strengths-based. And it's not, just kind of looking at what people's challenges are, but what can they can bring to a community.
I think it's important to remember, and this is just a universal truth about psychology. Thanks to technology, we can now identify some neurological differences within some conditions, but we don't put everyone for an ADHD assessment through an fMRI machine, So you could have neurological differences. I could have all the genetic markers that would indicate a propensity for ADHD.
Right.
However, I might not hit those thresholds. Now, what's happening is we have an acceptable margin of behaviour in society, don't we? And a lot of these diagnoses, including mental health, it's because we're standing out, we're falling outside the norm, and it's a very human response, despite how accepting and inclusive we love to think we are. It's a very human response to take a step back from that person.
You're different.
Yeah, it's a very natural response, and I think we need to look that we've created those margins. They weren't naturally given to us, and we didn't pick those margins off a tree. Over many thousands of years, we've developed what we think acceptable behaviour is. A lot of that acceptable behaviour is linked to productivity. If you actually break it down.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes we need to have a think about why we have these margins and what does it actually mean.
So the parameters really of what's acceptable and what's valued as well.
That's very much, I think if we look at a lot of, always strikes me with the ADHD diagnostic criteria, they're very, and I've got ADHD myself, so I hope I can say this, but they're very annoying behaviours. Do you know what I mean? I think, is that a problem for the individual, or is that because that's annoyed the person who's looking at them?
Yeah.
You've got
to, it's taking a step back again, isn't it?
Yeah. So is that a actual problem for the individual? Is it just frustrating for the person who's trying to run a class, run an office, anything? I think that's a big question in that.
And maybe the final one, which I'll throw in, is I think I would like to see a greater sense of there being one system when it comes to mental health.
Absolutely.
So the community sector and the world of clinical assessment and treatment are all part of and understand each other to be part of the same system, and can help people to navigate the pathway through that, and that's going to work for them, and to get to the right place quickly, so that we don't see people moving around and struggling.
I agree. There's so many little offshoots, little roads here, there, and everywhere, and a lot of our members get really confused between who's which service, and which acronym is which. Yeah. And actually, if we were all joined up, it wouldn't matter. But they get really confused.
Well, that's really important feedback.
I think prevention, not prevention of having autism or ADHD, but more prevention of individuals getting to that state where they need to seek clinical services.
Yes.
It's a very much prominent narrative of the current government, and I think personally, they're on the right track with that. The third sector is invaluable in that space.
Absolutely.
Invaluable. We can be so flexible, so agile. We can pull things together at the snap of the fingers, which would take literally years for NHS services. But as I said, I absolutely adore the NHS, but we have to be real about capability and capacity at the moment.
Each have their part to play, don't they?
Yeah.
And that's the thing. So, thank you very much,
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's lovely.
Interesting chat.
Is there anything else that you think you'd like to talk about that we've missed out?
We've touched on burnout, and we've touched on masking and camouflaging. I think from an autism perspective, masking and camouflaging,
that's quite big,
whatever terminology is really important. Because it has such a significant impact.
Particularly it has done for girls, I think, and women.
I think masking and camouflaging, whether the girls or females or male, has a huge impact on poor mental health outcomes. It was originally thought to be more seen in females, but actually it isn't gender specific. Obviously, females historically are more driven by sort of appearing to be more social, those kind of stereotypes. So you've got gender norms that play a part as well. But when you look at the research, there's an awful lot that's linked to masking and camouflaging. And what it brings back to is, why does a person mask and camouflage? I mean, first, it's important to say that they might not know that they're masking or camouflaging. It might be so intrinsic to who they are, so they don't actually know they're doing it. But for many, it's because they don't feel that they can be their true self. It's to do with that marginalisation again, and the pressure to be normal, whatever that, whatever that is.
There's a cost, isn't there? There's a psychological cost to masking and camouflage.
And the cost very often is their mental health. So I think we need to really look at that, and that is important. And that is really crucial, and is a really sort of preventative, proactive measure that we can take, to really reduce people's needs to camouflage and mask. But I think we're all in agreement, aren't we, that we need a society that is more flexible in how they determine what is normal, or how we define humanity. We need just a much broader.
Human society is a lot more than just a means of production, and I think we need to acknowledge that, don't we? There is a lot more to life. It's very hard for us to remember, but hopefully I do feel we're at a time where, do we have the technology and the know-how to now move away from those sort of singular sort of drive? I don't know. That's a very big question.
That's probably not the podcast.
That's probably a series.
That's probably the ... on which we can end. And I think.
Yeah.
Some very big issues.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
Absolutely.